Welcome again to Peter Kuznick, historian at the American University in Washington, D.C. And we're talking about the current situation with President Trump as it relates to a rather volatile and confusing international situation. But you were talking before about President Eisenhower and the general tendency for war scares. The Soviet the fear of the Soviet Union, and how it's even being repeated now, especially by European leaders with respect to Putin. And I wonder also how that looks with respect to China. Like, are we going down the path of war scare with China?
Absolutely. Let me just backtrack. The historian in me needs to make a point or two.
Yes.
Because it wasn't always Eisenhower who was fanning the flames of war and fear in that way. You know, my favorite, as you know, is Henry Wallace. And Wallace makes a speech on
Henry Wallace was the vice president under FDR until he bounced in favor of Truman being the vice president. But he also was a progressive leader of some note, and the guy who talked about the century of the common man,
exactly,
from the American century. So sorry, I just wanted to identify.
No, I think that's very important, because the sad thing is that people don't know Henry Wallace anymore. He was vice president from 41 to 45, second most popular man in America behind Franklin Roosevelt. And he should have been back on the ticket as vice president in 1945. The day the Democratic Convention met in Chicago, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll asking potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% said they wanted Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Truman. Somehow the party bosses controlled the convention and got Truman. But, it was Oliver Stone and I argue in Untold History that if Roosevelt had lived longer, or if Wallace had become president on April 12, 45, when Roosevelt died, there would have been no atomic bombings in World War II and no Cold War. All of history could have been different. But then Wallace stays in the cabinet. Roosevelt begs him to and says, you can have any position you want. And he made the same strange choice that Herbert Hoover made in 1921 to stay in there as Secretary of Commerce. And from that position, he fought against Truman's war policies till he got ousted in September of 1946. But I guess it was April 12th, 1946, the first anniversary of Roosevelt's death, Wallace says, the only kind of competition we want with the Soviets is to demonstrate that we can raise our standard of living faster during the next 20 years than Russia. We shall compete with Russia in serving the spiritual and physical needs of the common man. The only way to defeat communism in the world is to do a better and smoother job of maximum production and optimum distribution. Let's make it a clean race, a determined race, but above all, a peaceful race in the service of humanity. Russia can't ride roughshod over Eastern Europe and get away with it any more than we can do the same in Latin America or England and India and Africa. The source of our mistakes is fear. Russia fears Anglo-Saxon encirclement. We fear communist penetration. If these fears continue, the day will come when our sons and grandsons will pay for these fears with rivers of blood. Out of fear, great nations have been acting like cornered beasts, thinking only of survival. It goes on, so he was the last visionary, except for Kennedy, in the last year of Kennedy's presidency. And it's sad we don't have any of those kind of visionary leaders out there today. But the point I started to make before I got sidetracked was in 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, after they had tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile, Eisenhower downplayed it. He said it doesn't, and to prove that he was not concerned, he played 5 rounds of golf the next week, even more than Trump. And he said, "Oh, it doesn't bother me. They shot one small ball into space." Uh, and the reason why he knew that the Soviets were not ahead of us was that we had the U-2 spy planes, which he couldn't tell. And Dulles said that I could see every blade of grass in the Soviet Union. I knew that they didn't have missiles. However, it was the Democrats who made a big issue because they saw this as the issue that could ride them back into the White House in 19.
This is the use of fear to get power, and fear is a tremendous motivator.
And it was mostly John Kennedy who used it based on figures that he got from the columnist Joseph Alsop. And Kennedy made a huge deal about how far the Soviets were ahead of us. And then when he took office, the first thing he did is have
this was the missile gap.
The missile gap that existed in our favor. And so in October, Kennedy authorized Roswell Gilpatrick to make a speech announcing not only was not a missile gap, there was a huge missile gap in America's favor. The U.S. was up 10-1 to 100-1 in every category. And my friend Dan Ellsberg wrote that speech for Roswell Gilpatrick and said that we were way ahead. There's nothing to worry about. But still...
Well, it was also, was it not, a bit of a threat to the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev?
Exactly. They figured that the United States were preparing for a first strike against the Soviet Union to wipe it out. And Kennedy was getting briefed by Lebnitzer and other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on plans for a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union that could wipe out the Soviet Union.
Well, during that whole period, I believe the Strategic Air Command under Curtis LeMay and under Thomas Parr were very much planning for a strike. And in fact, my understanding is that those plans for striking and winning a nuclear war have never really gone away. But I just want to return to something you said when you were quoting Henry Wallace, this idea of the cornered beast. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but the fear of that the Soviets have in encirclement, and the fear we have of communist takeover of Western Europe or whatever it was. And this fear feeds on each other, and that our children and grandchildren may drown in rivers of blood. But this is something I think in international relations they call the security dilemma. Is that what appears to be a monster on the other side, from the monster's point of view, we're the monster, and yet that it often seems to me that this fairly simple idea that people fear each other and thus exaggerate the threat seems to be not understood or widely understood.
American planners were basing this on game theory, and it was not based, for example, with NSC 68 back in 1950 initially. It was not based on what any rational person thought that the Russians were planning or intended to do. It's what the Russians could potentially do if they were so malign that they wanted to destroy the world.
But isn't this always true? Is this true with Putin? Is that if you're a planner or if you're a scared person in the Quai d'Orsay, or you think, well, Putin could put together a tank army and roll across Europe and drive through the Champs-Élysées. It's conceivably possible. So I have to, as a military person, as a responsibility, to plan for that. But obviously Putin can't really do that. But from Putin's point of view, when he sees missiles in Poland and Romania, he is thinking, well, they're probably not going to fire at me, but they could. I mean, is this...
And that goes back to
how this happened, or
no, that's exactly how. Reagan had an epiphany at one point, and he said, "You know something? The Soviets actually take me literally. When I talk about our plans to destroy the Soviet Union, they think I'm really talking about and planning an attack on the Soviet Union. I never knew that they actually take me literally." And but as you're saying,
Yeah, no, that was in. I think it was in his diary. He was Reagan was saying that they really seem to be afraid of us, and how could that be? Because we are good,
yeah, we're so good.
and yet it was a realization, apparently a realization for him, which is remarkable.
Yeah, it's stunning that but
And where is this now, Peter? I mean, just to
worse.
because
It's
I know.
Barry, it's worse. And we look the pacing threat, according to Madison, 2018, is China. Right. In 2018, in the U.S. National Security Doctrine, we said the leading threat to the U.S. is no longer global international terrorism, it's Russia and China, with China is the pacing threat. Hegseth, our Secretary of War, whose body is covered with neo-Nazi tattoos, Pete Hegseth, said that we have to end the war in Ukraine so we can focus on the real enemy, China. And it's interesting, there's this through line with China that begins really in 2008. When you had look at the U.S. main planners against China, in 1990 and 91, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the leading thinkers in military planning shifted the focus from Russia to China. And then in October of 2011, Hillary Clinton announces her article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century. And there they announce the pivot. They say, it's the focus should no longer be on the Middle East or on Europe. We need to remove our troops from there and shift them to the Pacific, because that's where the future lies. And that's where the real threat comes from China. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, first with the Maidan uprising and then Luhansk and Donetsk and taking Crimea, sidetracks the U.S. effort for a while. But under Obama and then under Trump, and so Trump starts the trade wars against China and hyping all the China threat. And then we hope that when Biden got in there, he was going to reverse all of that. But Biden didn't. He came to power with 18 top advisors from the Center for a New American Security. That's the hotbed of China hawks. And so he doubles down on not only the tariffs, but the hostile rhetoric.
This pivot to China, Pete Hegseth's militarism, and everybody in the Pentagon, it seems, who are in power now, are focused on China. And you see a lot of stuff about how this is the fastest rise of nuclear weapons ever and so forth. But when Hillary Clinton does that, how much of that is a genuine fear that China is going to, I don't know, invade Australia? Or how much of it is to whip up votes? How much of it is, or how much of it is possibly driven by the profit motive for Lockheed, Boeing, Anduril now, Palantir? It's a genuine question. I often wonder that. I think it'd be too easy to say, "Oh, it's all driven by the capitalists." But
I know.
your view on that?
I think it's more what you were saying earlier about planning for the worst case scenarios and thinking what the most malign version of China could be. When I look at Russia and China, I give a lot of talks in Russia. I was just in Russia, Moscow recently, to chair the documentary jury at the Moscow International Film Festival. I've been to Moscow 9 times in the last, well, mostly before COVID, and then again. And I do a lot of Chinese TV, and I often make the point that as much respect as I have for what those countries have been able to achieve, I deplore the lack of democracy, the lack of criticism. I think that they should welcome, if I was a Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, I would welcome criticism. I'd welcome debate. I'd welcome dissenters. I think that's the heartblood of what makes a country strong and confident. And if they're really confident leaders, they should not cringe from that. And so, uh, but in terms of the how they view the United States, the comments from maybe if we take another break, I'll give you read you some of the comments after from Chinese leaders. For example, the statements by Xi Jinping, by Wang Wenbin, by other Chinese leaders, the official statements, they have a very different view of history in the world and the U.S. role in it than we do. And as is much of the world, why does the global South not go along with the U.S. demand for sanctions on Russia over Ukraine? Partly because they see the hypocrisy. They say, how can you so avidly deplore what Russia's doing after you invaded Vietnam and left 5 million deaths there, after you invaded, go through the whole litany of
Iraq, perhaps
everywhere.
more recently, yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think it's a very valid point. And you can't say that on mainstream American television. If you say that, you don't get invited on ever again. But but there's this group think about how awful what Russia is doing, instead of having a more balanced sense of what motivated them to do it. And even though you can be critical of it, it's not to turn them into a pariah and exaggerate what kind of threat they really represent.
Yeah, I mean it's true. You can talk about some of the root or some of the causes of that conflict, just as you can talk about you can criticize the Treaty of Versailles without endorsing Adolf Hitler. Not to compare Putin with Hitler, but the point is that it's possible to be critical of. But let me just ask you about the Chinese. Sorry, Chinese. Do they fear the United States? And what is their attitude? Because we were talking about cornered beasts and the sort of mutuality of fear. Is there fear in China, or are they just, oh, they're not going to touch us, we're going to take Taiwan and to hell with them?
I just had lunch today with two officials from the Chinese embassy, who I meet with pretty regularly. And I mean, they wanted to know, they were very concerned and wanted to talk about what's behind U.S. saber rattling. And I went through some of the history of that, because the greatest likelihood of war, world war, nuclear war, is probably over Taiwan, number one, and secondly, potentially over the South China Sea. And I see the planning of the China hawks, starting with Admiral Davidson in 2021, when he said that China is going to try to take Taiwan by force in 2027. And then everybody repeated that 2027 date without any evidence. And Xi Jinping said, I don't know where they come up with this date. We've never said anything about 2027. But that was the beginning. Then in early 2023, you had General Mike Minihan warning that he said, I expect war with China by 2025. And you had the Republican head of the Foreign Relations Committee, it was the Foreign Relations Committee, said, I agree with him. I hope it's not true, but I think 2025 is realistic. Then we had on August 20th, 2024, two very important articles came out. One by David Sanger in the New York Times said that the United States is preparing to simultaneously fight a three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea. Big David Sanger article. That same day, August 20th, 2024, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had an article saying that American nuclear planners are divided into two camps. One camp thinks that deterrence theory works. The other camp thinks that it's obsolete, that we now have the capability to launch a surprise nuclear attack against Russia and China that would wipe out their ability to retaliate. And they say the change is that, we always knew that ICBMs were vulnerable and that possibly fighter jets could be shot down, bombers could be shot down. But we always relied upon the third leg of the deterrent, nuclear submarines, as to be invulnerable because you didn't know where they were. It said with modern technology, between AI and new sonic technology, we can actually pinpoint the location of all the Russian and Chinese submarines. We could attack them first, and then neither Russia nor China would be able to retaliate. We could actually, there's this whole group of nuclear planners thinks we can win. Then General Thomas Buchanan, much more recently, came out with a statement where he said, we can fight and win a three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea and retain enough nuclear weapons that we can still establish U.S. hegemony and run the world afterwards. This is the kind of thinking. We think of them as, Strangelovian madmen, but these people have the ear of the presidents, of the top planners, and, but that idea about being able to wipe out the enemy. Back in 2006, you might recall, in Foreign Affairs magazine, the Council on Foreign Relations official publication, two nuclear planners, Lieber and Press, said that we have achieved in 2006 that capability to strike first in a way that neither Russia or China would be able to retaliate. The Washington Post reported heads were exploding in the Kremlin. They thought that was, official U.S. policy. Fortunately, it wasn't. But, how you've got people who I think are quite reckless in many of these positions of authority.
Well, yes. I mean, if that were possible, if you could actually strike first on China, Russia, and North Korea and wipe out their capacity to retaliate, in the process killing tens of millions of people. But you better be sure you win. You better be sure you get them all, because 3 or 4 or 5 will be so devastating on the United States. Washington, New York, Chicago, L.A.
Well, that's what Kennedy asked his advisors during the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many ICBMs are likely to get through? And they said, well, some of them will. And Kennedy said even one would not be acceptable.
It would cost him politically, you might say, but also, I mean, that was the inside of Ronald Reagan, which I don't think that Donald Trump has repeated that wonderful phrase: "A nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. Cannot be won and must never be fought."
Well, Putin just called for extending the New START treaty for a year, so we have time to negotiate a new treaty.
Yeah, yes.
Trump hasn't weighed in on that. He hasn't responded yet. He hasn't commented. But he did say recently that we have 100 times or at least 10 times more nuclear weapons than we need, that the world is a tinderbox at this point. Every once in a while, he
finally understood this, I think.
Makes a lucid comment like that.
Yes.
I wish he could stick to it or sustain a thought for more than like a couple minutes at a time.
Yeah, that is the issue where we began, is how erratic president he is, but also how he isn't necessarily locked into the same track of war than as other presidents have been or other leaders have been.
No, so there's a possibility that he's unorthodox enough that he will not pursue the American empire in the way that, or American hegemony. Certainly many of the deals that he's making, look, India is so important in the U.S. policy toward China. And why is he alienated, antagonizing India? I do all these Indian TV shows, and they are fit to be tied. They simply hate Trump at this point and are so angry with the United States. It's kind of shocking compared to what they were with the Howdy Modi stuff, Donald Trump.
So it might be, we might see them pushing an alliance between Russia, China, and India. That would be something. But yeah, I know you get going.
No, but I wanted to.
Yeah, you wanted to quote the Chinese. Yeah,
I mean, I've comment after comment by Chinese leaders along those lines. But one of my favorite stories is in 2019, when Jimmy Carter, who was a terrible president, but a great ex-president, and he's speaking to his congregation in Plains, Georgia, at his Baptist church. And he says to the congregation, He says, I got a call last night from Donald Trump, and Donald Trump wanted to talk about China. He's very concerned about the Chinese century and China's role in the world. And I told him, I'm not at all concerned about China. I said, and he says to the audience, do you know how many times China's been at war since 1979? And Biden and Carter says 0. He said the United States has constantly been at war. He said throughout our 242-year history, do you know how many years the United States has not been at war? Only 16 years out of 242. Said the United States is the biggest warmonger in the history of the world. And he said, while we've been at war spending $3 trillion, the actual figure was $8 trillion on these forever wars, he says China has been building high-speed railroad. They've got 18,000 miles of high-speed railroad. We have 0 miles of high-speed railroad. He said if we spent that money instead of on war, spend it on railroad, our roads wouldn't be collapsing. Our bridges wouldn't be collapsing. Our education system would be one of the best in the world. He went on like that, and it's such an important message that Americans don't have. They don't have that kind of perspective, which is why Oliver and I did Untold History and why you're doing the projects that you're working on.
Yes. Well, how, just to finally wrap that up, how can we and how can anyone maybe direct the change the direction away from a war fever, away from confrontation with China, and reduce the temperature? I was think that what you said about the Lithuanian foreign defense minister, and the thought that the path towards peace in Ukraine probably has something to do with their not being a member of NATO. That probably has to be part of the mix. But how could we prevent a rush to war with China or further rushing to war with Russia? How do we influence this very erratic president?
There recently has been some very positive developments on the international scene. One of the effects of Trump's trade wars against the world is that countries are looking for alternatives. Also, the hegemony of the dollar and the fact that the U.S. has been using the dollar to punish countries all over the world for whatever it doesn't like. If it doesn't like Brazil's courts, going after Bolsonaro, then the U.S. puts a 50% tariff on Brazil and on India and on Russia, all these tariffs, and on China and everywhere. What's happening is people are looking for new kinds of alliances, new kinds of markets, new kinds of trade relations, and new kinds of alliances. But what the positive development is that the third world, the global south, seems to be coming together. And the fact that a Modi would have the rapprochement that's going on between India and China is a potentially enormously positive development, as is this rise of the global south, rise of the BRICS, more and more countries wanting to join the BRICS nations. They're not going to develop their alternative currency overnight, but we're moving away from the hegemony of the dollar, and Donald Trump is accelerating that process. So I would like the United States to be part of that. I would like the United States to be a contributor to global development. But when Trump gets up there and he says that global warming is the biggest con job we've ever seen, and he goes on there and he attacks all these other countries, many of which are U.S. allies, and he talks like an idiot about the escalator and about his teleprompter not working. And if he finds out who's responsible, we're going to be bombing that country. Well, it was his own people in both cases who were responsible. But the kind of raving lunacy, talking about how great he is as a president, and how the best America's ever been, the American people aren't buying that. And Trump's approval ratings at the 6-month mark and again at the 8th-month mark are lower than every other president in U.S. history, except for Trump himself during his first term in 2017.
Well, maybe that doesn't matter if you can engineer the democracy sufficiently or create a crisis that you can suspend elections.
Which is where we start.
One would think that those are ridiculous things to say, but given the last few years, it doesn't seem impossible.
It's a real threat. And we know that Trump is looking at ways to prevent the 2026 midterms, in which the Republicans are likely to get their heads handed to them because their policies are so unpopular, and the 2028 elections. Is Trump capable of that? Absolutely. But we started off by talking about the threat of fascism in the United States. We've hardly touched on it. Much more about
pivoted to international affairs and the United States role and its historical role. But I think that's very valuable, actually. And you're about to go to Japan, I believe.
Yes,
which is obviously, given the pin of the crane on your lapel, I think has something to do with
where I got this?
Nuclear weapons.
But I got this. I nominated this year's winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, via Onidankyo.
Yeah.
They invited my wife and me to be part of their delegation in Oslo.
Okay.
And Tanaka-san, who gave the acceptance speech, gave these cranes, which is the Japanese peace symbol, to all the members of the delegation. So that's where I got this, and I've been wearing it ever since because it's such an important symbol. And so then to hear Ishiba, the current prime minister, talk not only about the need for an Asian NATO, but saying that Japan should have its own nuclear weapons and supporting Japan doubling its military budget, and saying that Japan will be there if there's fighting over Taiwan, that Japan is going to be the first one in. Mm-hmm. This is not Japan, the Japan that I know and love.
Yeah, and I guess we really can't go on that route, but it is, again, the inability to put yourself in the other fellow's shoes. I would think that from a Chinese point of view, a Japanese government that is talking about fighting China and with a nuclear weapon would bring historical memories that are quite painful.
Well, and we see that in terms of South Korea. When Yoon was the head of the government in South Korea, they had a rapprochement with Japan that was very unpopular in South Korea.
Right.
They haven't forgotten what Japan did. Mm-hmm. And China, the most Western experts say that China lost 12 to 13 million at Japanese hands in World War II, but the Chinese Communist Party says 35 million, which is mind-boggling. When I try to get my students to understand what the 27 million who the Soviets lost at German hands in World War II, what that means, I tell them that 27 million deaths is the equivalent of 9/11 is, in terms of deaths, 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. Yeah. 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years is what 27 million dead means. And, we lose track. We lose sense of history. We lose context. We lose perspective.
So history is important, good to remember. So thank you very much, Peter Kuznick. I do appreciate it. And thank you for joining theAnalysis.news. And don't forget, there is a donate button at the top right corner of the screen. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.